بعدين ندخل عن حياته، أهمية حياته برأيه هو بركان politics وشغلات، وفينا نحكي عن يافا، فينا نحكي عن القضية العربية، عن رام الله، الأردن، بنك accounts، كل اللي بدك إياه. وبعدين ندخل على more subjective issues about father-son relationship، توقف مع the grandparents، أمك، هالشغلات هاي. ويعني إذا وصلنا لهون بكون ممتاز. بس I want to get the crucial of his murder is at the beginning and at the end. It's like a circle that caps it all.
مرحبا. مساء الخير، مرحبا فيكم في مؤسسة عبد المحسن القطان. اليوم تستضيف مكتبة ليلى المقدادي إطلاق كتاب We Could Have Been Friends My Father and I للكاتب الفلسطيني رجا شحادة، وراح يشاركنا الحوار مع الكاتب بروفيسور بشارة دوماني. قبل ما نبدأ راح نرجع نهني رجا باسم فريق المؤسسة بمناسبة اختياره ضمن المجموعة الثانية من كتاب الجمعية الملكية للأدب اللي بتحتفل بالمساهمات الأدبية المهمة المنشورة باللغة الإنجليزية. شكراً لك ولكتاباتك. We are thrilled at Leila Miqdadi Library to host the launch of Raja's new book, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, a Palestinian Memoir. The book is a subtle psychological portrait of the author's relationship with his father during the 20th century battle for Palestinian human rights. Aziz Shehadeh was many things: lawyer, activist, and political detainee. He was also father of the best-selling author and activist Raja. In this new and searingly personal memoir, Raja Shehadeh unpicks the snags and complexities of their relationship. This is not only the story of the battle against the various oppressors of the Palestinians, but a moving portrait of a particular father and son relationship. للي بعرفش, Raja Shehadeh is a lawyer and writer, and the founder of the pioneering Palestinian human rights organization Al-Haq. He is the author of several acclaimed books, including Orwell Prize-winning Palestinian Walks, as well as Strangers in the House, Occupation Diaries, Language of War, Language of Peace, A Rift in Time, Where the Line is Drawn, and Going Home, A Walk Through 50 Years of Occupation. In the year 2022, he was chosen as the International Writer of the Royal Society of Literature. Also, Beshara Doumani is the president of Birzeit University in Palestine and the Mahmoud Darwish Chair for Palestinian Studies at Brown University. His research focuses on the social histories of people, places, and time periods marginalized by mainstream scholarship on the early modern and modern Middle East. Thank you and enjoy the evening.
مرحبا بالجميع. بدنا نحكي بالإنجليزي بالشيك اليوم. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to the Qattan Foundation for hosting this important event. I'm humbled to have the honor of posing questions and conversing with Raja Shehadeh. They say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and I would tweak it a bit to say that in terms of getting the Palestinian story out there across a wide audience, especially getting into the subjective dimensions of the Palestinian condition, one literary writer like Raja is worth 1,000 historians like myself. So the book, as with all of Raja's books, is wide-ranging from the personal to the political, space, time, and very intimate details. It takes a lot of courage to do what you do. But I think if we have to see a through line through most of the books, it would be that Raja is facing directly and head-on the three questions, fundamental questions that most Palestinians face and have been unable to resolve really for the last 120 years. And they are, who are we? And what do we want? And how do we want to get there? And we could have read, and we do read all the time, political science books about these issues, but really, again, they don't amount to much when we read the work of Raja Shehadeh. We could have been friends. There's a story about your father, Aziz, and your relationship to each other. And perhaps a good place to start would be for you, if you don't mind, to read a little bit of the opening, and then we'll take it from there.
Thank you, Beshara, for this introduction, and thank you, Abid, for the introduction. And thank you, Qattan, for hosting this event. The book is not can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes. The book is not chronological, so I will read from the very beginning of the book, chapter 1, sort of. I could hear him entering the office with his usual gusto. As always, I took a deep breath when my father came in. He stopped at the reception to get the latest messages, then asked, "Has anyone called?" With small, quick steps thumping the ground, he walked past my room, followed by his secretary, to whom he was already dictating letters concerning the day's court hearings. He was wearing a dark suit with a well-ironed white shirt and a black tie, and carrying his heavy black leather briefcase. Then he doubled back and peered through the open door to my room. He saw me looking over a map covered in cobweb lines and asked accusingly, "What are you doing? Don't you have any work to do?" Before I could explain, he had darted into his office to resume dictating. I stayed in my office, examining the new 1984 military order, plus the attached map that my father had seen me with. Road Plan number 50, as it was designated, was a blueprint for the Israeli Occupation Authority's long-term objective of creating a new West Bank road network that was bound to have a devastating effect on the Palestinian landscape, on traditional towns and villages, and agricultural areas. Studying it, I could see where future roads were to be built, how the existing network of roads was to be altered from a north-south to an east-west grid, and how the Jordan Valley was to get a new road, one that would better connect it to Israel and consolidate it as the country's eastern border. The implications were devastating. I gave my father time to finish dictating his letters. Then I walked over to his office and to show him the new order and map, which had only arrived in the post that day. When I suggested to him that we should submit objections to the proposal, he was not enthusiastic. He didn't seem to share my sense of foreboding about the impact that the order would have on the land. The phone rang and he answered, "Aziz Shehadeh here. How can I help you?" Waving me back, he sank into a conversation with his client. But I continued to think about the new road plan. A few weeks earlier, I had taken a solitary drive down what we then called the Latroon Road, since it linked the hilly town of Ramallah to the coastal city of Jaffa via the Latroon Monastery. On both sides of the road, I could see terraced hills dotted with olive trees in full leaf. The trees on the slopes of these undulating hills were all approximately the same height, and they were all olives. As I drove northwest, the hills were awash with sunlight, and the trees cast their shadows over the brown earth all the way down to the wadi. On the hill to my right was a plot that belonged to my client. He had just heard that the occupation authorities had expropriated it and were planning to establish Beit Horon and settle it with Israeli Jews. I couldn't understand Why? What was the point of putting Israeli civilians in the midst of our hills, so close to a Palestinian village? How would these settlers get their electricity and water? They couldn't depend on the inadequate services from the nearby village. Could they possibly have plans for an alternative infrastructure? It was then that the worrying thought struck me like lightning. What if our Israeli occupiers, who already had total control of the networks serving us, were proposing to construct a superior network for water, electricity, and roads connecting the settlements to Israel? That would mean they would cut us off without affecting their own people. We would be completely at their mercy for essential services. When I saw the military order announcing the new road plan, I feared that the Israeli military was taking the first step to prepare the way for this eventuality.
Thank you, Raja. And so, did you tell that to your father? What happened afterwards?
Well, what happened afterwards was we started immediately working on the legal aspects of the matter. And of course, my father knew exactly how to go about it, and he knew the land use planning laws, which he directed me to. And we found out that there was no basis in the law for a whole grid. There was only a basis for single roads. And so we thought this would be a point that we could depend on in a case. And then we submitted literally thousands of small objections to the plan by various people from all over the West Bank. And we also drafted a brief in which we suggested that the matter should be before the International Court of Justice in The Hague as a question. And we thought the UN General Assembly could refer the matter to the ICJ. And then we tried to get the people outside to help in this, but nobody was interested, and the matter died, except for these small objections, some of which made a little bit of difference in the way the road went, but the general plan continued. And of course, we know today what this means, what this plan has done to our landscape and to the relationship between Israel and the West Bank.
So, was that the first time you really seriously worked with your father on a very big, politically consequential issue?
No, I was working with my father for many years, and we had a good working relationship together. So that was okay, except that I was also involved with human rights and had put so much time into human rights, which I was passionate about. And my father thought, what are you doing with human rights? You should pay more attention to the office. And then, of course, he was under a lot of pressure from the military, who were asking him to stop the activities of his son because they didn't want me to go on. And my father, of course, wouldn't do that, but he was under pressure from the Israelis. And so that was partly a conflict between us. He thought human rights are not going to get us anywhere. It's political matters that are important, and I was interested in politics, and I was interested in human rights, and he wasn't interested in human rights. So that's the conflict.
And the conflict, of course, between father and son is not unique to Raja Shehadeh and Aziz Shehadeh, but often father and son imagine that there will be a day in the future in which they sit down and talk and reconcile and somehow work things out and get to understand each other better, maybe somewhere later in old age. But that was not destined to happen in your case. Your father was murdered.
That's right. And before he was murdered, there was a lot of tension between us because, of course, he was very tolerant of me in many ways because I had left my studies in England and went to India to explore other aspects of myself and life and so on. And when I came back, he was so kind as not to judge me or scold me or anything. He said, I don't understand why you did it, but you did it, and fine, and now you're back. And so that was a very important thing. But at the same time, I wanted him to discuss it. I wanted our relationship to be one of discussion and so on. And I think I was almost affected by the books that I was reading of father-son relationships and how it should be. and perhaps by films in Western media and so on about the relationship. And of course, father-son relationship here is not this, it's not like that. The father doesn't come and hug the son and say, I love you, and all this. What would have seemed like nonsense then. So I yearned for this. Perhaps I shouldn't have, but I did. And I wanted our relationship to be one of discussion and talk and so on. And so I burdened it in a sense. And at the same time, he was feeling very frustrated at the end of his life because he knew what should be done and he couldn't get it to happen. And so that was a difficult thing. And that reflected on him and his life. And I kept trying to tell him, why bother? You've done what you could, and so on. And I didn't realize what old age does to a person. I was much younger. I was in the early 40s, and I didn't realize how he, in his 70s, how he felt and how he was dealing with old age. And I wasn't kind to him in that sense. And that was another area of conflict between us.
After his murder, and you're a writer, you've been writing all along.
Yeah, my interest has always been in literary writing, and I started with writing a draft of a novel, autobiographical novel, literary novel, which had nothing to do with politics. And then I went to the United States for the first time in 1974 and realized how Palestinians who were active in the cause, knew very little about what was really happening in the West Bank. And I came back and I thought, I must write and inform them and inform more people around the world of what is really happening and how the Israeli occupation is not a benevolent occupation at all. And so I started doing that, and I started writing also legal things about the changes in the law, and that eventually took over and took me took all my energy and for many years.
But during all these years you're writing, and by the way, they still don't know what's going on the ground today after all this, but all these years of writing, were you not also thinking, I should write about my father?
Well, what happened was that after he was murdered, I spent many years, literally many years, pursuing the investigation with the police who was not really investigating. He was just a sham. He was just pretending to be investigating and doing everything to show that they were investigating, but the main one who was the murderer was not investigated, as we have discovered later. And so that took so much out of me, and I felt I needed to write about it for many years, and then finally, after the Oslo, I was relieved of human rights work after the Oslo, because I thought all the work that we did has come to very little. And so then I thought I must put myself into serious writing. And before that, I thought I could write in between. I could work in the office, work in the human rights, and write. And you could do that, but you cannot write good writing if you don't give it enough time. And so then I stopped human rights work and had more time and started writing. And then I realized that I couldn't write about anything else until I've written about my father, because I had thought so much about him. There was so much to write, and I wanted to write about him. And I did the book, Strangers in the House, which was my first fully realized literary work.
So Strangers in the House was the first one which dealt seriously with your father, but apparently, now that we have this book, it didn't go all the way. You felt you needed to write something again.
Well, what happened after Strangers in the House was that I felt relieved that I put down something that had been on my mind so much for many years. And I went beyond that into writing other books, several other books about other subjects, not about my father. Although in some of these books, I also mention my father. And for example, in Going Home, in the course of the walk in the city, I get to my parents' house, and I have an imagined dialogue with my father in a way that didn't happen. But then something happened, which was that I saw a directory of Jaffa, telephone directory of Jaffa. And the telephone directory had the name of my father and the name of my grandfather, Salim. And I thought, you know, they were there, and it is real, and somehow all that life and reality is just denied. And then somebody, Mahmoud Hawari actually, who was working in the British Museum, went across the street to the to the bookstore, which has old books, and he found a tiny book that my father had written in 1936, ABC of the Arab Cause, and he brought it to me. And I hadn't seen it before, and my father hadn't shown it to me. And then I looked at it and thought that my father was such a good writer, such a lucid writer. And then, of course, the archives which were there all along in my cabinet closed in, and I didn't want to go into them. I started opening them and discovering more and more and more. And there was so much material to write that I had to write this book.
So you had some archival triggers, so to speak.
Yeah, that's
the
right.
map, which is what you open up the book with, was in a way the product, but the triggers were a phone directory and this little pamphlet. And then you realize you have sitting right next to you a kind of a vernacular archive. Palestinians don't have a state. There's no state archive. Most of our stories are told using locally generated information, whether it's memory or oral history or letters or photographs, etc. But you had next to you a filing cabinets. And I was wondering, these filing cabinets came to existence because he was a dutiful lawyer who just filed everything? Or was he a hoarder who could not get rid of anything? Or did he curate these cabinets by selecting and putting some things, but not really caring about other things? What's your impression?
Well, I know that he was working in the last few years on these archives, and he was very carefully putting them together and putting them in different files and marking each file and being very careful, meticulous. He was very meticulous. And he wrote, numbered them and wrote index and so on. And he put them there, and I'm not sure whether he wanted to use them to write, but I don't think so, because we had discussed about writing several times, writing his memoir. And he thought, no, writing memoirs is for the people who don't have work to do, and I'm not into writing memoirs. And so he didn't write, he never wrote a memoir. And whether he thought that I might write something later on, I don't know. This is impossible to know. But he put them in a very careful manner, and he had everything, every little slip of paper. When he was in exile, he had the bill from the hotel, everything.
So you went on a journey.
Yes.
It was a journey of discovering
Absolutely.
your father through these archives.
Absolutely.
But also discovering yourself.
Absolutely.
Like how he may have impacted you and what are the similarities from his experiences to your experiences today.
Yeah.
And what did you discover? How would you, did your idea of who your father was change in your mind? Or
Well, before I
just reaffirmed it?
Yeah, before I mention this, I must say that in the book, I didn't only write about these archives. I also wanted to evoke and paint the picture of what Jaffa was like and their life in Jaffa, because otherwise the misery of life in Ramallah after Jaffa would not have been clear, because in Jaffa they had everything and very successful office and marriage and so on. And in Ramallah, they had nothing really when they came. And so I could only do that by, and then I also wanted to to write about the relationship between them. And that needed that kind of background. Now, what did I discover about my father? I discovered a lot of things. And I discovered many similarities between us, which I hadn't realized. First of all, I discovered that he was a very good writer in Arabic and English. He wrote very clearly, very well, and this rather surprised me, because I never thought that I knew he wrote a lot for the courts and so on, but I didn't think he would be able to write so well other than legal things. And then I discovered also that, and that's also partly from thinking of it imaginatively, that our experiences are so similar, because he came from Jaffa to Ramallah, and Ramallah and the West Bank was changing from being Palestinian area, with Palestinian laws and everything, and Palestinian way of life, into Jordanian. And likewise, I was experiencing the change in, and of course, physically it changes as well. And likewise, I was seeing the changes now in terms of Israel turning this land into part of Israel. So there was that similarity between our two experiences. And I hadn't realized this before.
So, well, that raises the question of the meaning of politics to a certain extent. Your book talks a lot about the whole question of what it doesn't mean to be a refugee, to lose everything, but also immediately to pick up and start working on your life again. And in the case of your father, on other people's lives again. Letters and letters saying it's very important for the refugees to have a voice. Somebody has to speak for them. The question of the bank accounts, all the Palestinians that lost their money when Israel confiscated bank accounts, and how he fought a tremendous battle, eventually won in that case. And of course, the celebrated issue of his defense of the assassination of the people who assassinated King Abdullah. And so the archive speaks about two things that are usually what I call the shadow years of Palestinian history, things that are not paid too much attention to, especially these days. One is the whole question of the real experience of the refugees in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and of course, in the case of the West Bank, the whole issue of the Jordanian period, which was not a pleasant period for your father. Was he a political man? Or how would you describe his politics and why he did what he did? I'm asking too many questions, but you can take your time.
Take one by one.
So let's start with having lost everything and then picked up, and his attempts to get the voices of the refugees heard.
Well, first of all, that he, as I realized from thinking about it and reading his stuff, he couldn't imagine that they would not be returning. He couldn't imagine that they would not be returning. He was absolutely sure that they would be returning to Jaffa and to the former life in Palestine. And so he did everything possible. But then he was also sure that there will be perfidy by the Arab states. And so, and he was right, of course, because in 1947, King Abdullah had met with the Zionists and planned things. And in 1948, in February, the British Foreign Minister, Ernest Bevin, had told Abdullah that he will give him the green light to snatch the part of Palestine that was not going to be the Israeli state. And so my father was adamant that the Palestinians must have a voice of their own. And he worked very, very hard, he, along with others, of course, worked very hard to establish a body, which they called the Ramallah Convention, and that later would change its name, to represent the Palestinians in the Reconciliation Commission, the UN Reconciliation Commission. And he worked very hard on this, and he went to Lausanne, and he pursued the matter for many years, and that, of course, made him very much in enmity with Jordan, which didn't like this. And then, of course, he went to the meeting that was held in Jericho by King Abdullah in 1948, 49. And at that meeting, he said that we don't want to allow you, Jordan, to take over the West Bank unconditionally. And Abdullah responded, بيعتكم ردت إليكم. Your acts of allegiance is returned to you. And he was seen as an enemy of Jordan from that point. So that was the thing. And then during the course of his life in the early years of the West Bank and later, he saw how Jordan was doing everything to minimize the development in the West Bank and maximize the development in the East Bank. So anytime anybody came with a plan for a factory, for any project in the West Bank, they would say, we will not give you a permit unless you take it to the East Bank. And then, of course, in the case of Jerusalem, there was not any plans for increasing the area of Jerusalem. They didn't give permits to building on French Hill and Mount Scopus, and left them open and free, so that the Israelis, when they came, they found them empty, and they were able to use them and settle them. So these were the experiences that he had with Jordan, which were very rough.
And you said in your book that, quote, his courage was his Achilles heel. What did you mean by that?
Because he threw himself on things and didn't think twice what the consequences would be, and didn't care, because he knew what was right, and he did what was right always, what was right in his view. So in the case of the Jericho conference, he could have thought that maybe I should be more careful since Jordan is going to be taking over. He didn't do that. And King Abdullah murder, he went and defended the people, and he didn't care. And then there was the case of the blocked accounts, of course. Do you want me to talk about the blocked account?
I think it's a terrific story. It's kind of long and complex, so it's up to you. But
well, the blocked account case is
one of the few victories.
Yeah, it's very, very important, because it was before, during the mandate, the British, pound sterling was equal to the Palestinian pound, exactly. And then the British decided to sever the relationship between the pound and the Palestinian pound. And then by 1948, in May, 14 May, they stopped issuing Palestinian pounds. And so when the Palestinians tried to withdraw their money, and then Israel throws all the accounts of the Palestinians in Barclays Bank, in Jaffa and other parts of Palestine. So when the people who were outside tried to withdraw their money from Barclays Bank outside, they were told, we cannot, because Israel has frozen the accounts. So the Arab Bank took a case against Barclays Bank in London and lost it. And then my father studied the case and thought there are loopholes, and did another case against the Barclays Bank in Jerusalem, and he won. And so this was one of the first cases where, and after he won, all the blocked accounts were unblocked, and people were able to get their money.
And so what happened to him in 1967?
Well, before 67, we have the story also.
Oh, his prison and
yeah.
Oh, well, okay.
Well, after the blocked account, he went to London. Do we have time?
That's what I was wondering. We have time. Okay, go ahead.
After the blocked account, he went to London to negotiate the release of the deposit boxes. And while he was in London, he got a note that as soon as he returns to Ramallah, to Jordan at that time, he will be arrested. And so he stayed outside in exile for 3 years, unable to return. And that was his reward for winning the case. And during that time, he submitted a letter to the Labour Party in London, telling them about Glob Basha, John Bagot Glob, who was doing...
The person who really ran the Jordanian regime for so long, yes.
And then, of course, he thought that if the British knew what this man was doing, of torture and suppression of democracy and so on, they would take action to stop him. And instead, he got this order that he would be arrested. And this is a case of his not thinking about anything except to do what he thinks is right.
Right, and he did end up getting arrested.
Yeah, he did, of course.
But he came back, and in 1967, he seemed to have his own perspective on what should be happening. 67, 68 are the golden years in some ways of the rise of the Palestinian resistance, of armed struggle, of a people's war, of refugee camps becoming rekindled with passion and fire, but he wasn't there in that kind of thinking.
Well, he had been doing everything he could for many years to promote the case of the refugees and get a Palestinian state. And then when 67 happened, he realized that the Arab states had not fought and we cannot depend on them. And he thought that the best way is to make peace with Israel on the basis of a two-state solution and resolve all the outstanding issues. And he went around immediately after 67, all around the West Bank and Gaza, and collected 50 signatures on a document that he submitted to the Israeli government, saying that we will make peace on the basis of a withdrawal of the Israeli army and Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, including East Jerusalem, and resolving all the issues.
Which could not have endeared him to many people at that time, considering he was doing this right after the Battle of Karami, for example, etc. Would you say that he had some blind spots in his political reading of the world around him, or was it just?
Well, he was rational, and his rational mind told him that what is the use of the armed struggle when it's not going to be possible to get any result that ends the state of Israel? Because no country in the world, not even the Soviet Union, not even Russia Soviet Union at that time, or America, of course, or Britain, or Europe, or any country in the world would allow the destruction of Israel. So if we're not going to destroy Israel, and all we can get is the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem because of the withdrawal of the army and resolution of all the issues, then it makes sense to diplomacy would be the best solution and not armed struggle. And that was his position. And of course, he didn't realize, I think, that the Palestinians needed the armed struggle to regain their sense of dignity and so on, which they've been trying to regain forever since that time, of course.
And so he ended up with the conclusion that real victory is the victory in which both sides are victors.
Yes, he thought that real victory is when we both win. And I think that this is proving to be correct, because Israel is obviously seemingly winning, and yet it's not winning in terms of what is happening to destroy its state through the occupation and the prolongation of the occupation. So the real victory is when we both win.
Meanwhile, he was living a life at home and with your mother. And you describe yourself as, because I'm moving here now to what I think is the most interesting part of the book, which is the subjective issues, and sort of, let's say, call them domestic politics as opposed to national politics. You describe yourself as being always aligned with your mother. Perhaps you could explain why that is, but also, did that change as you imagined the conversations with him as you were writing the book?
Oh, yeah, my appreciation of him through the book, writing the book, greatly enhanced, because there were so many things that I didn't know. And of course, my mother was the raconteur, and she was the one who told the stories, and she told the stories of how much she suffered when he was in exile, and how much he suffered when he was in Jaffa prison. And so my feelings were with her. And she always said, why does he have to do this? Why does he have to go from one trouble thing to another, trouble point to another? And so as a young person who didn't know better, I thought, yes, why did he have to do that? And of course, he didn't explain when he came back why he did it and what happened and so on. And so it was a story that I only got one side of, and that influenced my judgment, of course.
But could it also be that you were in a house full of women?
Yes, I was a sickly child, and there were women all around, and the women were very articulate and constantly told stories, which of course helped me become a writer, I suppose. So he was a man of action. He was an extrovert. And he wasn't a person who would come home and tell us what happened, or when he came from Jaffa, tell us what happened in Jaffa. I had to...
Jaffa is the prison.
The desert prison. And so I had to investigate this on my own and use my imagination and visit the prison, Jaffa in Jordan, in order to be able to describe it the way I did in the book.
So he himself went through a father-son relationship too. So your book is a part of a long chain of father-son sort of encounters that helped form the next generations. In his case, he was facing two different sets of visions of who we are, from Salim and from Boulos, and then the two different mothers of his wife and of himself. Can you tell us a little bit about what they represented in terms of understanding themselves to be and what real life is about?
Well, he always said that he missed his mother because his mother died during the First World War from typhus. And he was only 3 years old, and he couldn't even say goodbye to her because they were afraid of infection. And he always said that the last he saw of his mother was through an open slit door, and she waved to him goodbye, and that was it. And this had stayed with him all his life. And so he literally didn't have a mother. And he felt the loss a lot. And his father was a political man. Boulos Shehadeh, who was editor of Mir'at al-Sharq. And he influenced, of course, my father, because my father would sit around and hear the talks and so on. But I don't think Boulos was much of a father in terms of affection and so on, traditional father as well. And so usually the father who doesn't have a father who does this kind of thing that I was yearning for doesn't do it for his sons. And that was partly it. And so that was the thing. And then his relationship with my mother was sometimes almost fatherly. You know, he depended on her so much emotionally. And that I describe as well. Now, Salim, my maternal grandfather, was a man who was a judge in Jaffa during the mandate, and a very rational man. And he never took part in politics, and he said, I have enough troubles of my own, and never took part in politics, but he understood politics. So when my father went to the Jericho conference, for example, my grandfather, Salim, had already left Jaffa and went to Beirut. And from Beirut, he wrote a letter to my father, which my mother always kept beside her bed, telling her, tell Aziz he should not think of himself as a politician and should not meddle in politics, and the future is with Jordan. And he did wrong in going against Abdullah. And that was in 1949. And so Salim was the kind of rational person who stood back and didn't get involved. My father was the man who was very involved and very active. And I was influenced by both, although I never met Salim. But the story of Salim was always being told about how he was and how rational he was and so on. And so I was affected by both.
In fact, there are several male figures in the book, and one can look at your treatment of them as I wouldn't use the word study of, but reflections on the meanings of masculinity in Palestinian culture and how they changed over time. For example, your uncle Fuad.
Yes, my uncle Fuad also was an important figure in my life because we worked together for many years. And I saw how different he was from my father and how sensible he was and how not a risk taker. And he knew how to deal with people and with politics and survived for many years, long life, always dealing with things rationally and effectively and never getting into trouble as my father did all the time. So he was a very important figure in my life as well, and I write about him a lot. And I think that by writing about all these characters in the book, I help paint out a picture of my father in a better way. Now, masculinity, I always was a rebel against the traditional masculinity, and I wanted to be a different kind of man, and a kind of man who was interested in art and interested in beauty and so on. And I didn't want to just imitate anybody. And in fact, maybe I didn't have a role figure in my father, although when I was young, I always felt awe towards my father. And I remember when I thought of him as somebody who always wins all the cases, and so I should also be a winner. So whenever I took my school report, I would be the first in class, and I would come to my father and show him very proudly, thinking that this is what he deserves, because he's a great man, and he never said anything except smile, and that was enough for me.
Let's go back to the trauma of his murder, and I think we'll conclude here. So you felt you needed to write about your father again, but you knew that you can't just write a regular biography. You needed to somehow imagine big parts of the book, the archive plus imagined conversations with him. Do you feel that you've done what you sought to do, you've unblocked something, or are we going to read another book about your father at some point?
Well, you never know, because, but I feel that I have done the job now, and I don't think that I want to go back to that subject. But it was important for me to write the book not only about my father, but also about the work that he did, because it is something that should be known by Palestinians as well. So I was feeling that responsibility as well of writing about these issues and these cases, which are not so well known. And so that was an important aspect of the book for me. But
there is the investigation itself. You spent years working on it. They were pretending to be really investigating, and then something happened. Well, more recently.
Yeah, several years ago, Aziz Shehadeh told me that he had met with a member of the previous member of the Israeli cabinet, and he told him that the police closed the file, did not continue the investigation. And so I took that as evidence of what I suspected and left it there, and wrote afterward for Strangers in the House, in which I said about this, and I said that this for me makes the case enough. But then more recently, last year in fact, I decided no, I wanted evidence, and I wanted to embarrass the Israeli police. And so I asked a lawyer in Tel Aviv to follow up the case and get me the files of the investigation so that I will see for myself. And this has been going on since exactly a year now, and the police is not willing to give us the files, and so now if they continue to refuse, we'll have to go to the High Court for whatever that means, but we'll try.
And this is the spirit of your father in many ways, right? I mean, he's just pushing on, and I suppose,
It took me years, though. He would have done it just like that.
You think so?
Yeah.
Okay, well, we actually don't have a choice. Whether we do it quickly or we take our time, we have no choice but to push on. This is the situation we're in. And now maybe we can push on to the audience. Yes. Thank you, Raja. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your questions.
I want to thank you both for this discussion, and I want to thank Raja Shehadeh for writing a very moving and penetrating study of father-son relationship, which I read together with Strangers in the House, and I can see that there is a new depth, new thinking about your relationship and about the archival material that you discussed. There is one aspect of it I want to ask you about, which is Aziz's relationship with Mohammed Nimr al-Hawari. He was a kind of partner in the refugee conference with Hawari before Hawari defected and went to Nazareth and became a citizen of the state and the judge. And then Aziz went on to form, after the Ramallah conference, a movement for restoring the rights of refugees. Now, this is what I want to ask you about. This movement is not named in the book. It's called, it seems to be an evolution of the Ramallah conference, but you talk about it as a movement, although there are no names, no associates. There's only one person who is mentioned in a secondary form. Was Aziz the leader of this movement? What was this movement? Who was in it? And what did it achieve? Is it the same as the Ramallah conference? Or because this movement is very significant. It's a movement to restore refugee rights, which happened many years before the establishment of Fatah in '59 and many years before the PLO. So could you shed some light on this event?
Yes. First about the relationship with Hawari. They were together with the third person in Lausanne conference in Lausanne. And then apparently the Hawari got permission from the Israelis to go back. And he decided to go back to Nazareth. And there he built himself up as a lawyer and had a career and a politician and so on. My father didn't choose to go back, although he could have chosen. And then as to the movement, well, it is the Ramallah Convention, which has changed its name to, what was it? I'm not sure now. It changed its name, but it's the same group. And my father was the secretary of that movement. It's not exactly movement, but it's a grouping of refugees. And the number of refugees who were involved in it was tremendous. It was hundreds. And they continued to enlarge into not only the members of in West Bank and Gaza, but also in East Jordan. And then they had great trouble in continuing their work because they were stopped by the Jordanians, actually, in various ways. Oh, the refugees of various, any refugee could be involved, I mean, could be a member.
Let me ask you, actually I have not read the book yet, but I promise you I will read it thoroughly, okay? But can you tell us why was he in the Jafar? Was he related in any way with the coup d'etat in the 50s of the last century or something like that?
Well, in '58, there was the attempted coup and the coup in Iraq. And Jordan was very worried about something happening, and they got all the leaders who were involved in politics into arrest. They arrested them. And my father got arrested in the course of that. And he wasn't tried, and he wasn't convicted, and he wasn't, there was no offense. I mean, they didn't tell him why. He just was arrested, taken to Jafar, and kept there for 2 months, and then released. That was it. So he wasn't part of any. He ended up with the communists because they had separate sections for the various groupings, and he was independent, so he ended up with the communists, I think. But he wasn't a communist.
Raja, thank you very much for this presentation. I'd like to ask you, given that you wrote this book, obviously several decades after your late father's death, how hard was it to piece together the missing information that you spoke about, having to go back and so on, to piece together the information about his life? Did you have to resort to others? How did you go about this?
Well, I used archives. I used the memoirs of other people who were at the time involved, and I used my imagination, and I used the archive. These were the basis for the book. But I also used my imagination in several points.
Hello. Congratulations, first and foremost, congratulations on telling your story as well as your father's when he wasn't necessarily doing that. So I want to acknowledge you for that. And the other question that keeps ringing in my mind is, what kind of friends would you be? And what made him laugh?
Well, he had a sense of humor that he laughed a lot, actually. But we were not buddies as such, and there was a tension between us. And my hope, had he not been murdered in time, would have been that I could.
This battery must be out.
That in time I could have sobered up and realized things that I hadn't realized, such as his age and such as his achievements, and I would have possibly grown up also. And because I was so involved in my own life and my own business and my own world that I couldn't go beyond that and reach out to him. And I didn't realize the importance of reaching out in time, because I didn't think, I thought there was time. So had the murder not happened, we could have possibly become closer and understood each other better.
And did he have a lot of friends?
Oh yeah, he was very sociable. He was very sociable. He was almost my exact opposite. He was an extrovert. He liked people very much and so on. And he almost my exact opposite.
طيب, هلا for the last question.
Thank you, Raja. One last question, maybe. We've seen you using your imagination many times in Palestinian Walks, which was the best, I think, wonderful, and in this book and other Going Home and et cetera, et cetera. Are we gonna see a novel soon? And what is it gonna be like?
The answer is no. I'm not interested in novels. I'm interested in literary writing, and I have still much to write about. Not a novel, something. I have a lot to write about that is not that it uses the imagination, but it's not a novel. I'm not interested in novels, in writing novels.
Two fast questions for the latecomers.
Thank you so much. Well, congratulations again on the book. And this is really important that you're breaking generational cycles today with the launch of this book and the great memoir that you're telling in that. I think my question would be, I didn't read it yet, but I promise I will. I think I'm hearing a lot about the political leader your father were, and that like the legacy still lives on. What would you think current, like say contemporary or maybe future leaders of Palestine should take from that memoir and from your father's legacy and lead on with to change maybe, or lead the country towards a better place, hopefully?
Well, he always thought of things to do. So, for example, when after the blocked account case, he had many other cases that he wanted to do. He said that the orchards in Jaffa are still producing and they are making money, and so why not ask for the rent of these places? And Israel must pay that amount. And so he wanted to make a case against that. But he was stopped, of course. And so I think that the best thing to take from him is the point that there's always something to be done, and never give up, and go on and go on and go on. And of course, we are still going on, and eventually we will get there as Palestinians, because the possibility of giving up is never in our mind. And I think that is something that he had also worked on very much.
Hi, Raja. Being married into the family, I know some stories and some history of your father, your great father, and my father-in-law, Ammo Fuad, Allah yarhamu. To me, he's like an encyclopedia. So I heard a lot of stories from him and from his sons, of course. And that's why I just wanted to go on a different tangent, knowing you've been working so much with politics and human rights. Fast forward to today, and the politics over there with the Zionists. What do you think is going on with these demonstrations, and do they have anything to do with, or hopefully, can we look positively at what's going on in terms of the internal upheaval in their society and how it's going to be, hopefully, reflect positively on us, or there's no such thing?
Well, when I think of what is going there at the moment, I realize that they are not taking into account that all these years from the 1980s, there was already a group of people who were violating the law, and nothing was done to stop them. And so that, of course, was a contributing factor to the destruction of their legal system. And now they do not realize this and do not take that into account, and they will not take it into account because they cannot. And so they are only speaking about democracy as if there is possibility for a democracy under apartheid. We never spoke of South Africa as a country under democratic regime because there was apartheid. Likewise in Israel. They cannot have democracy while there is apartheid. So it's, in a sense, a losing case. And of course, for them, there are things that they have to do because they're worried about some freedoms, liberal freedoms, that the new regime will affect. And so they have to do this. But it's not to do with us at all, I think.
Thank you, Raja. Thank you, Beshara. Thank you for being here.